Last Friday we had a wonderful celebration of Passover, and we had lots of fun, but we really reflected on the goodness of God who through Yeshua sanctified us and brought us out of slavery from sin into a new life. And we entered then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that's a week of eating bread without leaven, without yeast. And it's a time for me of reflection on my previous life, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread for me is the idea that we shouldn't go back to our old ways, and we should enter into this time of freedom that God has given us through Yeshua with joy and with gladness, but also with a real understanding that going back is not a way forward. And this week there's been a lot of talk in the news about not going back when we hear of that terrible murder of the young journalist in Derry, who was shot by what we understand now as the new IRA. And nobody wants to go back to those days where people in Ireland are being killed, and people were killed in the UK as well, in Warrington, in the bombings by the IRA, and nobody wants to go back to those times, and nobody wants to go back to the times where the Tamil Tigers 10, 12 years ago were murdering people in Sri Lanka, and the mass murder of worshippers, Christian worshippers in Sri Lanka is a devastating blow to not only the country but to Christianity. And it's like we don't want to go back to those times, and the Sri Lankans don't want to go back. But we don't want to go back either to the ways that we grew up in churches where we celebrated Christmas and Easter and Sunday, because they're not the ways of God. And that takes me to the place where this week I've been looking at my previous Catholic upbringing and the things that were celebrated there, like Easter and Christmas and Sunday and all those things. And I don't want to go back to those things at all. I really don't. And when I look at what churches have been doing in this last week, in this last period, and certainly over the Easter weekend, seeing things like people getting up and standing on mountain sides and in parks and things, watching the rising of the sun to the east. The origins of that go back and are referenced in Ezekiel 8, where the priests are facing the east, and it's to do with sun worship, and I don't want to be connected with that at all. I want to celebrate Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the godly feasts. And then there are the churches who do Easter egg hunts for the children, and have all sorts of things going on connected to eggs and rabbits, which are connected to sun worship and fertility, the fertility god of Ostra, and I don't want to go back to those things. The things that are pagan in their elements, but also I don't want to be a pastor who teaches wrongly. I don't get it that some of these pastors can actually teach that when they know that the egg and the rabbit are connected to fertility, and I really don't want to upset anybody by saying this, but once you understand the feasts of the Lord and understand the depth of them and how much Yeshua has fulfilled them, how can we go back to the old system? How can we do that? How can we go back to Sunday, Easter and Christmas? I really don't understand that, and it's difficult for me to see how people can do that. And then I look in Scripture, and looking at the Scripture in 1 Kings, I see that Jeroboam, who was one of the worst kings in Israel, he was the king of of Israel in the north of Israel, and he created a worship center in Samaria at Shechem, so that the people of Israel could worship in the way that Jeroboam wanted them to, and that was basically sun worship. And Jeroboam changed the dates of the worship system that God had given to the Jewish people. And we read it in 1 Kings 12:32 that Jeroboam ordained that they should keep the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, in the 8th month. And that was completely wrong. And Jeroboam did that to stop people going to Jerusalem to celebrate the correct feasts, the feasts of the Lord. And he thought, well, he would create a golden calf at Dan and Bethel and create a new worship system. And he did that and established a worship system that was not in sync with God's worship system from Leviticus 23. And then we read in Hosea 2, verses 11 and onwards, that God said he would do away with the feasts of Israel. And what he meant was the feasts that Jeroboam had established, because in Hosea we see 200 years later, after Jeroboam had established his own feasts, that Israel was still celebrating those feasts that Jeroboam had created and established, and God said he was going to do away with those things, and clearly we can see in history that the church has just picked up on those things and continued with those things that, like Jeroboam had established, which are connected to sun worship and fertility worship. But God will do away with them. We read in Ezekiel 40, chapter 40 through to 45, that when Yeshua comes back, he will establish a new temple in Jerusalem, and he will restore all the feasts and the Sabbath in the way that they were meant to be established by God when he told the Israelites to celebrate feasts at certain times, in certain seasons, and in certain ways. And there will be no going back then to the old ways of the pagan and the sun worshippers. It will be a constant celebration of what Yeshua has done throughout the millennium years of his reign, and there won't be an opportunity to celebrate any other gods, because God will make sure that we keep on line with exactly what he has asked us to do. And why shouldn't we? Why should we follow any other gods or any other systems? Why should we do that? There's no point. I think one of the things that we have within us in our flesh is that we don't want to celebrate God. We want to celebrate his creation, and that's not right. And it's a fleshly thing, it's a traditional thing that's in us, and actually what we need to establish is that God is God, and there is no other God, and there is no other way. And once we establish that God's ways are the ways that we should follow, then we'll never want to go back. And I think that those that do go back have not grasped who God is. They've not grasped the depth of the spiritual realm. They've not grasped the depth of the purposes of God for mankind. They've not grasped the importance of following God and keeping to his statutes and his decrees. And so this Feast of Unleavened Bread, I've been thinking a lot about those things, and thinking a lot about Jeroboam, how he brought the people of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, into idolatry and took them to a place where they sinned, and they continued to sin for those 200 years until, as God says in Hosea 2, he would do away with their feasts and their celebrations. And so at the end, now we come to the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I think I'm more resolved than ever into teaching the true things of God, the true purposes of God. And I just want to ask you to help in that teaching and to establish and the things of God, and to create in our minds and in our hearts the idea that going back to the pagan ways is something that is against our the way that we should live. It's against God. It's against the things of the spirit realm, and we don't want to be people who go back. We want to be people who go forward. So this year now, that from Passover to Passover, unleavened bread to the next unleavened bread, let's look forward to see how we can continue to establish the truth in our worship system, the truth of Passover, a feast of unleavened bread, first fruits, and all those other feasts, and particularly now the feasts of the end of the season. We look forward to the Feast of Trumpets, which celebrates his return, the Feast of Atonement, which is the feast that Yeshua will fulfill when he comes back for the Jewish people, and then the final Feast of Tabernacles, which is not in the 8th month as Jeroboam would have it. It's actually in the 7th month. So let's prepare for that, and let's see how we can prepare to make those feasts, and particularly Tabernacles this year, a really special event. So I hope, like me, you won't want to go back, but you'll want to go forward this year with the things of God, and help others to go forward with the things of God as well. So Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.